Let's hear next from the group on Pervious Pavement for enhanced aquifer recharge.
Great, do you have the two? Okay, so our group, we did our presentation in conjunction with the Rockland County Water Task Force, and our project was specifically looking at green infrastructure and specifically within that pervious pavement as a way to manage stormwater as well as recharge aquifers. So our team, there are 6 of us, all of us Barnard and Columbia students within either the environmental policy or sustainable development programs. And all of us were really excited to work with this particular client, and all of us chose specifically this one because of its involvement with green infrastructure.
So just to introduce our client, we worked with Patricia Drake, who was the Rockland County's Water Task Force coordinator. And her main concern was Rockland's water quantity and quality. And pervious pavement rose up as a possible solution to addressing these problems. They previously worked with the Stevens Institute of Technology to figure out design and site selection. And we basically continued this project, but had a slightly different focus of looking at the barriers to implementation. So that includes actually looking at site selections, funding, permitting, and those type of things. So to give a little background on Rockland, the continued population growth and low annual rainfall has put a lot of stress on the aquifers, especially during peak demands in summer. So Rockland is looking to permeable pavement as a way of addressing these issues, also addressing the issue of impervious surfaces. So impervious surfaces can prevent aquifer recharge because the rainfall is not able to infiltrate into the ground. Also, it constitutes to water quality compromise because it washes off surface pollutants directly into bodies of water.
Great. So before we kind of talk about our project specifically, we did kind of want to give a quick introduction to what green infrastructure is. So some kind of the more maybe well-known types of green infrastructure are like green roofs. But then when it comes to stormwater management and aquifer recharge, some of the different green infrastructure you can find, which you'll see in this picture right here, are trenches, bioswales, rain gardens, and it's these specific ones work to kind of, trying to synergize both physical infrastructure and then plant life. But specifically for Rockland County, we were looking at permeable pavement and the ways in which they can implement it all throughout the county. So quickly, permeable pavement specifically, it's different from your traditional pavement because it does allow water to infiltrate. And so that allows for aquifer recharge, like Emily had said, and stormwater management. So the way that you go about implementing permeable pavement, it really does depend on a lot of different design criteria, and kind of is dependent on the site, some of the budgetary constraints, and then municipal needs. So this is just a kind of a cool video kind of to show how permeable pavement works, and it's actually pretty incredible. You see just how much water is being put into this parking lot, and rather than it becoming a runoff and flooding the entire parking lot, it's actually percolating down beneath the parking lot.
So we had 4 main components to our project. The first was compiling a list of recommendations for pervious pavement. And this is for site selections. So these were the different criteria, which we'll go over in the next slide. We also created an overview of the regulatory framework and permits. And then we also did a cost-benefit report of potential funding and grant sources. And last, we created an educational pamphlet for municipal leaders. Here's our site selection recommendations. You can see our chart. This is just a little snippet of what we created. And we culled it from the New York State DEC Stormwater Design Manual. And we have the criteria, which is listed out, and we also broke them into different categories, as you see listed here. So soil topography, watershed, runoff, setback, land use, management, and weather. And we also added different graphics on the side so you can see the different structures and what they look like. So the more criteria that the sites meet, the better. However, they are recommendations, so if they do not, the engineer must say no alternative design and risk mitigation measures, so to basically say how they're working around these issues.
So looking at some of the different recommendations that we compiled based off of our literature review and based off of specifically the Stormwater Manual, we looked at different sites within Rockland, so just looking at the entire county, and based on kind of some of the research that we did, some of the most suitable installation projects could be in commuter shopping malls and school parking lots, as well as in park pathways. So as you can see right here, you have the Route 304 Park and Ride, and then also down here the West Nyack and the Rockland Journal News parking lot. So those are both really great sites based on some of our different site criteria, like soil infiltration and kind of maybe what the site's prior use before implementation.
So I'm just going to go over a brief overview of the permits and regulations that we found. So we researched and compiled a list and also gave them a step-by-step process. But the main relevant permit is the SEPT's general permit for stormwater discharges. And this applies for areas over 1 acre, and most of these areas that we're going to be implementing green infrastructure, particularly permeable pavement, are not going to be so large. However, the municipality retains the right and the ability to decrease the size for which the permit applies, and therefore they can be stricter in their regulations. They also have to create a stormwater pollution prevention plan, which includes different things like a description of the site, possible pollutants and control measures, and that's just another way of regulating the installation of this. So as much as permits and regulations can seem like a barrier to implementing these things, it's also really important to keep just an oversight of the construction and make sure that they're not compromising water quality standards.
So aside from one of the barriers, which she had just said was permit and regulations, our client also expressed concern with trying to find financing and grant opportunities related to basically implementing permeable pavement. So one of our main deliverables too at this point was a compilation of different grants and financing options. And so we gave them a series of different, a list of recommendations, both federal and state grants, and then recommended that within those different types of grants that they not only apply to stormwater management, but also to climate preparedness, environmental education, and water quality grants as well. And so as well, we did have 2 forms of cost-benefit analysis. So those are 2 different kinds that we provided them. And the first one being a quantitative cost analysis, right? So comparing permeable pavement with traditional asphalt, and then as well different forms of green infrastructure like rain gardens. So giving that cost comparison so they can see for themselves not only the price of pavement itself, but also the maintenance costs and how long the actual installation can last. As well as the second part was a qualitative analysis, so benefits and challenges, some of those being, in this case, increase in property value, reduced municipal and private costs, and recharging groundwater, but then some of the challenges being that you must have upfront capital investment and then finding the specialists to actually implement this infrastructure.
So our last deliverable was the fact sheet that we created. So this is just a little view of what we did. And this is really for municipal leaders to look at it, to educate them, to understand what permeable pavement is, because sometimes it's a new technology, relatively new, and basically saying why it is a really good option for Rockland. So in conclusion, green infrastructure can really aid Rockland with stormwater management and their issues with aquifer recharge, but there are some key considerations to just always have in mind. So the first is site selection, because that really affects how the permeable pavement works. Maintenance is totally required because without that, it will just shorten the life of the pavement and also its efficacy. And getting the permits is really important to make sure that you're abiding by the laws and also making sure that you're maintaining the water quality. And obviously funding is really important to finance these projects.
So I guess the next steps as far as this project goes, we do have our final presentation to the Rockland community on December 15th, which we hope there's a good turnout. And then we'll also be working with Rockland County to disseminate some of the information in the fact sheet that we just showed you. so that the community organizers and government officials can have access to that information and know how Rockland County can potentially implement it in the future. And then also there's like hoping kind of next steps either for future collaboration with Columbia, the Columbia Capstone, how the Rockland Water Task Force can stay involved either with us individually or just more further with the institution. So thank you so much. If you guys have any questions.
I just had a quick question about the technology itself. So you guys broadly addressed this, but have there been any examples in the past where permeable pavement has been used and there have been water quality issues, and like what has been done to circumvent that? I assume that's why the regulatory framework is in action or is established, but do you guys know of examples where that's happened?
So before we did any of the kind of presentation stuff, we did a huge case study and literature review of different cities that have implemented permeable pavement. So we found cities like Philadelphia, I think Vancouver, different cities around the U.S. and Canada have implemented it. And I think the biggest problem that they've come across is winter maintenance. So salting and sanding can be an issue with regards to like the salt seeping into the pavement and then resulting in seeping into the aquifers. But one benefit of the permeable pavement is that you actually need less salt and sanding in the winter. So it's kind of a trade-off. So there's the risk that it can infiltrate the water, but you also need less of it. So that was the main thing that we came across in terms of water quality.
Also, some of our contacts, we were talking to a few engineers, and they did say that the water does infiltrate directly into the ground, but the soil does filter some of the pollutants as well. So we're getting the benefit of the soil as well.
Isn't that a problem even if you don't have pervious areas? The salt is already acknowledged in many municipalities as, you know, as a hazard, so that it would go off of asphalt very easily. Is there a greater issue with pervious?
I think the only difference is that in one situation when you have an impervious surface, it's running off and going into a waterway, for example, while when you have a pervious surface, it's going directly down into the soil right beneath you. So it's more acute in that sense, and it's literally polluting the ground that you're walking on. But I mean, like we said, that's why the kind of the site recommendations and the design recommendations are so key, is because there are ways to prevent these issues from happening, and you can really mitigate them and reap the benefits of the permeable pavement and kind of avoid these kind of catastrophic possibilities, if you will.
I guess I'm, like everyone else, more curious about the technology. Like, how exactly does it work? I don't know if this works.
There's the thing.
And I guess also, like, I feel like there must be other ways of, like, non-polluting salt or non-polluting means of, you know, making ice less dangerous.
Yeah, so to quickly answer your first question, this is a good diagram to kind of show how it works. So where normal pavement, you just kind of lay down just fake rock. With permeable pavement, this upper layer itself is much more porous. And then the real key is that you actually dig out almost 6 feet beneath when you're laying this down. And you put in really porous rock. You have some surface at the bottom that lets it really infiltrate down into the ground. Whereas normal pavement is just, so this actually shows it too. Normal pavement, the top part here is not as porous, and it doesn't have this very porous material beneath it. So that's kind of how the permeable pavement kind of soaks it all up. There are different kinds as well. It's not just, you don't just have to use pavement, which like paves the whole area. You can use pavers or little like cobblestone tiles, and those come in the kind where the tiles themselves aren't permeable, but the gaps between them are designed to like let all the water go through the gaps. Or you can get pavers where the pavers themselves are also absorbent. There's like a lot of different ways to do it, and depending on the site where you're installing it, you can decide. And the second part of your question was about salt? Sorry. So
could you repeat the question?
It was just, I should talk into this. The question was about, we mentioned that permeable pavement requires less salt in the winter. And the reason it actually relates back to this porous design is that it's harder for ice to form on a surface like this. And I guess the concern is that you're salting the roads, one of the things that makes permeable pavement effective is those pores, and when you're salting the roads, you run the risk of clogging up all those gaps. So that's the reason that you're trying to kind of use this technology in areas that don't need salting, which is why our recommendations are like park pathways or not high traffic areas. Like we're not putting this on highways or like curved roads, we're putting these in parking lots. One of the sites we visited actually just, the Pratt Institute, they don't salt it in the winter and they just didn't use the parking lot in the winter. But it does anyone have anything to add?
I mean, so we've come across some pretty creative management practices that people have developed. Like one person recommended using beet juice and kind of applying that to the pavement, and it works. And it's not applicable everywhere, and you're not going to have an entire municipality kind of running over their streets with beet juice. But I mean, if you're a private property owner and you have kind of a driveway that is porous, you can apply beet juice and you will kind of avoid the icing. But like Jenny just mentioned, it is part of the site recommendation is that you install this kind of infrastructure in an area where the icing isn't kind of a huge issue. If you can, a parking lot that kind of doesn't have a very high volume, where people will be able to kind of put their cars somewhere else if the pavement is indeed iced over, and where it's not going to put anyone's life at risk, really. So, yeah.